not only was the United States getting out in a very disorderly fashion, but that Ashraf Ghani was not the person to hold it together. Within 1 week, all the cities of Afghanistan fall. And they're not, and they don't start in the Pashtun areas. They start in Herat, they start in Mazar, and they go into Kabul. And he is unable to even mount a defense for Kabul, which is a mountain city. It could have been defended. But that, as I say, that's not unusual, because once there's an assumption that a government is gone, then its supporters disappear. And then the enemies just walk in and think they are the great victors. One of the most unfortunate things is every group that takes power that way then assumes that they have total power over the country because it fell so easily. And they generally discover within a few years that that was mistaken.
But this is a land of extraordinary diversity, and still it somehow has held together. So tell us what unites this bewildering diversity of tribal and ethnic groups into one nation. Why don't the Tajiks go off with Tajikistan, or Uzbeks with Uzbekistan, or the Hazaras with Iran, and the Pashtuns create a greater Pakhtunistan, which is part of Pakistan? So how is it that this land that began as a buffer state still continues as one political entity?
Okay, well, you have to remember it's been a political entity back to the mid-18th century.
Yes.
You look at the borders today, that's pretty long, right?
Yes.
And if Afghanistan was going to fall apart, it would have already fallen apart. One of the reasons is that Afghanistan does have a lot of ethnic groups. Occasionally, they fight with one another. But there's never been a sense of ethnic nationalism in Afghanistan. That is, the belief that an ethnic group should rule itself.
Mm-hmm.
They live in a multi-ethnic country in which multi-ethnicity is taken as default. And therefore, the question is, who's going to be dominant in a multi-ethnic society, not who's going to be exclusive. Because if you're exclusive, then the only people to dominate are your own people, which is tough. So instead, people like to maintain the system that they've got and improve their position within it.
Yeah, but the Pashtuns dominate and the others are playing second fiddle.
Well, yes and no, because certainly as far as the non-Pashtuns are concerned, yeah, the Pashtuns dominate. But if you then go to the Pashtuns, they'll say, when Karzai was in power, the people from the east would say, no, it's those Pashtuns from the south that dominate. When Ashraf Ghani was in power, the Kandahari said, no, it's those Pashtuns from the east, because he identified with the east. And then if you go to the Pashtuns in the east and say, well, you guys are dominant, and they'd say, no, we aren't. It's those people in Logar, Ashraf's Brahms. They're the only ones that benefit. And on the Tajik side in 2002, I was meeting with General Dawood, who had taken Kunduz. He was from that area. He would be labeled a Tajik. But Tajik is not a term that's usually used internally in Afghanistan. And I said,
what is used internally then?
Internal things. People will talk about a Panjshiri, a Harati,
yes,
a Kabuli, that they only dealing with outsiders would they ever use that term. It's not, it's a descriptive term. It doesn't have any real meaning.
Panjshiri meaning those from the Panjshir Valley.
It's much more.
There's another valley. I'm forgetting the name. There's another general from there. I'm forgetting it. Just adjacent to the Panjshir Valley.
It was Darab. There's a bunch of, you name the valley that people will call themselves from that area or from the province.
Yeah.
And when I interviewed General Dawood, and this was in 2002, and I said, well, it's a Tajik-dominated government in 2002. And he said, it's not a Tajik-dominated government. He says, it's a Panjshiri-dominated government. He said, we people in the north, Tajiks, we haven't gotten anything out of these people. The people of Badakhshan, Takhar, Kunduz, we don't have our fair share of power. So don't call it Tajiks. It's really Panjshiris. So when you get down to it, it's outsiders identify these people with their larger ethnic group. But inside Afghanistan, sometimes it comes down to a micro-ethnic group that they're identified. So the solidarity is not there. In particular, it's not the nationalism that we assume ethnicity equals nationalism. But Central Asia for millennia has been multi-ethnic, and in multi-ethnic empires particularly, and you go back to the Ottoman Empire, you historically have a dominant minority, a ruling minority. And in Afghanistan, before the Pashtuns, the dominant groups were Turks and Mongols for close to 1,000 years. Nobody in Afghanistan presumed that they were going to be ruled by their own people. It was always some military elite that came in, and their job was governance. Their job was running the state. If they did a decent job, then you owed them taxes, you owed them loyalty. If they didn't, then you owed them nothing. That's sort of Thomas Hobbes's point of view of a monarch. If a monarch protects your life and property, you should not rebel. If he doesn't, you can switch to somebody else. But what you see in Afghanistan is, again, huge numbers of ethnic groups, but where the ethnic groups overlap. If you're an ethnic group, there's no solidarity necessarily from a person that you would call a Tajik in Herat and one from Badakhshan on the other side of the country. They might be both Persian-speaking Sunnis, which is kind of how we generally define these groups. But they don't have that much in common, except at the national level. No group in Afghanistan necessarily assumes that they would be better off by breaking away to have their own nationality. Because right now, Afghanistan is a country the size of France, and it's able to hold its own against outsiders, even more powerful outsiders. The fear that regional people have is if you broke away, then you might end up like Tajikistan, or remote and subject to interference by your neighbors. So historically, what people have been willing to put up with is having a central government that they might not necessarily be pleased with or be ideal, but its job is to protect the nation of Afghanistan, the territory of Afghanistan. And if it does that job, then it's doing what it's supposed to do. And that the idea that you would trade that off to have smaller and smaller units that are more homogenous, people realize is, in the long run, not a particularly good trade-off. They're being very practical in their politics about this. Even the Pashtuns who talk about Pashtunistan have never made it clear, like, well, where would the Pashtuns in Afghanistan fit in this? In a true Pashtunistan, the majority of Pashtuns would be on the Pakistani side of the border. They'd be richer, better educated, and that would actually turn the Pashtuns on the Afghan side of the border essentially into subalterns into the state that they had created. So that might not be such a good idea.
They'll be poorer cousins.
They would. So as I put it, the Afghan, in terms of national power, people are more interested in having the national government recognize local autonomy, allowing them to live their lives and govern themselves to some extent, formally or informally, than they are in having a sovereign place that they can call their own, because that's a very romantic notion. But Afghanistan is a land of arranged marriages, not romantic marriages.
So is India. So is Pakistan.
Yes. So when you're creating a polity, you have to put initial attractions aside and perhaps go with something that you wouldn't necessarily have chosen for yourself, but that you learn to live with and perhaps even come to see might be a better choice than what you have made yourself. But they take a very unromantic attitude towards politics, because how do you know? Ethnic politics is often a style of infatuation. looks very good, but as soon as one group has gone independence, you immediately find another subgroup that says, well, what about us? We should be independent too. And with a plethora of groups in Afghanistan, that's potentially a never-ending process. Better to agree that we all live together, because a state this size, a country that has a reputation for independence, makes us all potentially safer than going our own ways.
So Afghanistan is unlikely to go the Yugoslavia or the Sudan way.
Before that can happen, there have to be politicians that have been pushing for that, been selling that idea. And the interesting thing is, over the past 40, 50 years, not a single politician in Afghanistan has ever even raised that as a possibility, or a threat that if you don't give us what we want, we'll ally with somebody else. That's not in their political vocabulary. If Afghanistan were to break apart, it would likely break apart along ethnic lines, but it would not, that would be likely coming from above and not from below. That if there was an anti-Taliban alliance that broke away from the Taliban and it split ethnically, that's a possibility. But no group inside Afghanistan sees enough in common with its co-ethnics to think about themselves as a single polity. So, and the history is essentially going back to the mid 18th century. This area and its regions have held together in this formation for more than 250 years.
And not the exact borders. The Taliban.
Not the exact, no, the borders, but in terms of the regions of Afghanistan, the four or five regions that are constitute the main cities, main regions of Afghanistan. The regions go back all the way to the Persian Empire. If you look at what are the capitals in the 5th century BC, they're Herat, they're Kabul, they're Kandahar, they're Balkh. They're very old. Sometimes they've been part of a single state, sometimes they've been divided up. But that kind of politics comes from an older idea of understanding what politics is about, which is distribution of power and resources. And that is treated often, sometimes in a coldly pragmatic fashion. And not thinking, is this the best of all possible worlds? But how can we avoid the worst of all possible worlds?
All right. So speaking of the worst of all possible worlds, we've been discussing the Taliban of the air, and we've been mentioning how the Taliban has done something. Taliban 2.0 has done something which Taliban 1.0 didn't do, which is say that women cannot be involved at all with international relief efforts in a country where a traditional society doesn't allow man-woman interaction. So what is going on with the Taliban? Where are things headed?
Well, right now the Taliban have, at least the ones based in Kandahar, seem to have an extreme version of wanting women out of the economy, which is unusual if one turns to neighboring Iran. Certainly in Islamic Republic, maybe Shia rather than Sunni, but women played and do play an immense role in the economy. And the argument is over how should they be dressed, or how should they be educated.
They are highly educated in Iran.
They are.
Women are more educated than men on average now.
Yes, that's so, and it has been said that actually families felt freer to send their girls to university under the Islamic Republic as opposed to the Shah, because the Islamic Republic was standing for conservative values. So in some sense, families might feel safer to do it. So you actually encourage more women's education, paradoxically. But in Afghanistan, where this comes from, this extreme concern, is not always clear to me, because again, in rural Afghanistan, there's gender segregation, but that gender segregation takes place among, strangers, particularly strange men. But so many people are related to one another in a village that there's plenty of interaction between men and women. They're not seen as strangers. But the other thing is, and this was true in the 1990s, when you wanted to support widows and orphans with food aid, who interviews the widows and orphans? Who provides the food? You had to have a women's staff because you were dealing with women. You couldn't send strange men to do a census or to hand out, food. That would go against not so much Islam, but Afghan local customary practices. So it's rather striking that they have taken this extreme view, because you can't possibly operate a relief system without employing women. Now, it could be that they're simply pressing the international community to do what we say or leave, with the expectation the international community will give in because they're worried about people starving, which is certainly a legitimate concern. But certainly some of the more practically oriented Taliban are thinking that's probably too great a risk to do. We have enough problems without the loss of $2 or $3 billion in food aid, which we desperately need, and over an issue that should be rather easy to finesse in terms of whatever strictures they want to put on gender segregation, but still having women involved. But it's also 20 years of change in Afghanistan. This is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s. Women have been educated in very large numbers, including to the university level. It's not clear that they're willing to put up with this.
It's also a more urban society, as you point out. That's historically unprecedented.
Afghanistan, yes, it was easier to impose these values when the urban population that disagreed with them was, less than 10% of the population. Today it's probably closer to 30% of the population, and that is unprecedented in Afghanistan. But it's not clear that the Taliban actually know how to run a modern economy or an urban society in which rural values or ways that you could run a village cannot simply be scaled up to run a city of 4 or 5 million people.
Understood. Now, so what next? If the Taliban is not being able to govern, if it's not being able to feed its people, is it looking at a potential crisis? Can we expect the unexpected?
Well, there's likely to be some kind of crisis. What it is not clear. I mean, even their allies in Pakistan are finding them recalcitrant, unwilling to compromise. If you have all of your neighbors turn against you, it's hard to make a go of it, in part because they may decide that it's worth financing opposition to you. That was the condition that happened in the Civil War in the 1990s, and that was not a very good period for Afghanistan. People don't want to go back to that, but if an Afghan government lacks resources from the outside, then it has to tax its own people. And historically, that's pitted the government against the rural population in which it's most popular, because if you're taking 20% of somebody's crop in taxes, and those people are not used to paying taxes, and you're under conditions in which there's not enough food to go around, then you are liable to see that politicized in a sense, that the government is failing in its obligations. Right now, it's restored a certain amount of order, and also people are uncertain about, well, what would replace it? They certainly don't want to necessarily see, the violence of a resumed war. but to the extent that the Taliban are unable to make things work, one would first expect probably divisions within the Taliban themselves, who, if you will, revolutions eat their own. And at a certain point, sometimes the most radical, tend to find themselves victims of their own success, in that people believe, or their own followers believe, that if this revolution is going to succeed, whatever the basis of the revolution, we need to get rid of the people who are its most extreme exponents, because you can't, this is kind of charisma you cannot routinize. You've got to, if you will, even in China, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution is rejected by his own Communist Party, is that we're never going to get China moving forward unless the party that brought them all to power gets rid of the people that seem to be taking them down. And that's a possibility in Afghanistan, well, because again, if you've got different factions that have different power bases, at what point do they begin to see their interests different from those of other regions, and begin to say, why should we take the authority of the supreme leader in Kandahar when he seems to be causing us so much problem? Right now, that doesn't seem to be a problem, but it could be in the future.
You're alluding to the Haqqani brothers.
Yes, because after all, they're not clerics. They may be Islamists, they may be focusing on an Islamic State, but unlike the Taliban, their origins are not in madrasas. Their origins, to some extent, come out of a much older tribal tradition. Their father, after all, was an ally of the Americans, the Pakistanis, and the Saudis fighting the Soviets. They were Ronald Reagan's freedom fighters at one point. No, they're not. But it's the type of thing that, if you're looking at practicality, it's not clear that they're willing to sacrifice the success of their victory on the altar of some gender segregation policy that they don't necessarily see as particularly important.
So Afghanistan will go through some turbulence. It may seem it's orderly and relatively peaceful and under the Taliban's thumb, but we could expect some disturbances ahead.
It was completely under the Taliban's thumb in 2001, and in 10 weeks it was gone. I don't expect the Americans or anybody else to be invading it, but in Afghanistan, unexpected things happen.
Yeah, you mentioned there are 20,000 Taliban soldiers right now.
Well, yeah, there may be more than that. They're paying for a very large army that's not fighting, but it's Afghan armies, in the absence of foreign powers to pay for them, tend to be the size of police departments in large major urban cities. I mean, and we don't expect police departments to fight wars, right? So it's something to see, is that also when you have historically in Afghanistan, you can focus opposition on driving foreigners out. That tends to unite opposition in Afghanistan. Once the foreigners are gone, it's just you don't go to heaven by killing fellow Afghans, right? So an honorable jihad begins to look far more messy and more criminal when essentially you're dealing with your compatriots.
Excellent. So you've touched upon the relations being strained between the Taliban and Pakistan, and you mentioned that Pakistan basically got a bag of coal for Christmas. What's going on there? What's the latest?
Well, I don't know what the latest is, but Pakistan seems to be remarkably frustrated because they invested in the Taliban supported them, sort of helped them come to power. And then every one of the aims that the Pakistani government had, that they thought this new government could bring about, has failed. They have not recognized the Duran line as the border. They have not expelled the Taliban, Pakistani Taliban, from Afghanistan. Well, they seem to be turning a blind eye that when Pakistani insurgents in Afghanistan attack Pakistan, if anything, once they're in power, they seem, from Pakistan's perspective, to have forgotten they were clients. And from their perspective is, we're not clients anymore. And this was the same problem Pakistan had in the 1990s. Pakistan advised Mullah Omar that he should expel Osama bin Laden, otherwise the Americans would arrive. And he refused. Ruined Pakistan's foreign policy for the next 20 years. So if anything, the lesson they should learn is that backing insurgents is one thing. Putting a government in Kabul is quite something else, because then it has its own interest and they're not necessarily yours.
Yeah, so they can fund an insurgency, but not a government.
No, Pakistan is having such economic problems right now that the Taliban can hardly turn to them and say, you know, we're going to throw out the UN. You provide $2 billion in food aid. Pakistan has no money to do this. So from an Afghan perspective, you know, what use are you now? You know, we've gotten what we've got. But, you know, it's like, let's see what the Chinese have to offer. Or
I'm glad you touched upon the Chinese. So today I was reading that the Belt and Road Initiative might be coming to Afghanistan. So what are the Chinese doing? There are talks between the Pakistanis, the Talibanis, and of course the Chinese Communist Party, apparatchiks. So what is going on there in this ménage à trois?
Well, they would, you know, Pakistan is one of their keen allies. A lot of Belt and Road Initiative projects there, but Pakistan
they have
has
the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor.
Yeah, they have, but you know, kind of runs through a set of mountains that is like not really suitable for large-scale travel.
Yeah.
But the real difficulty is that even in Pakistan, Pakistani military has to provide a considerable amount of protection for Chinese engineers, builders, and others. And there is no such security in Afghanistan for that kind of infrastructure project. Also, I'm sure on the Chinese point of view is, whatever loans you made to the Taliban government, do you think they would pay them back? And do you think they would care if they didn't? You know, it's default could be, you know, like what the Afghan Taliban would have in mind. You build it, we'll use it. But the bigger thing is, as long as the Islamic State is currently operating in Afghanistan against the Taliban, they're doing their best to attack Chinese projects. And I think essentially to show the Taliban can't provide the security for this kind of huge investment that would be required to do a Belt and Road Initiative. So in some ways, while China is looking at it, it fits its strategy of linking sort of interior Asia together. There's a lot of resources in Afghanistan. I don't see how they get there because they've got a government that cannot guarantee security for Chinese, and the Chinese do not like to hire locals to do the work. They like to send in Chinese. So it seems to me that even if they wanted to, they'd be a bit stuck.
It's likely to be a stillborn child, even if they manage to.
There could be some projects. They bought some oil resources. They still have rights to a copper mine, but it's still problematic. It's amazing that even after 20 years of Western domination in Afghanistan, I can't think of a single Western multinational than invested in Afghanistan.
Mhm.
Even though it has lithium, it has copper, it has iron, oil, gas, it has a lot of resources. But no Western company was willing to take the risk
Mhm.
to make the investment.
So it's like Hotel California. You can check in, but you can't check out.
Well, you can't check out with what you want, that's for sure.
Thomas Barfield, it's been a real pleasure, a great honor to speak with you. I would recommend to those of you who are listening to this to buy his book. It's a fantastic work of scholarship, and you can read him and follow him. I hope he'll be publishing op-eds and articles with us very soon. Thank you so much for your time, and see you very soon.
And thank you for having me.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.